Hey everyone, it's spooky season. That's right, it's October. One of these introductions all year that's actually true because I'm filming these in October 2023. Anyway, October, most fun month, one of the most fun months of the year. This month's assignment is called Shallow Depth of Field and Deep Depth of Field, okay? Last month, the assignment aimed to help you see how images can play with time. This month, we'll work on seeing how you can use depth of field to direct the viewer to seeing specific parts or elements of your image. Last month, we were playing with how we perceived the passage of time. This month, we're playing with how we perceive the relationship we have with space. For this assignment, take photos across the aperture range and with shallow and deep depths of field. So if you've never done this before, this is a fun thing to do. Take your camera, shoot from wide open to stop down of the exact same subject with the exact same photo composition. It will tell you quite a bit, if you've never done this, it will tell you quite a bit about how your lens performs. And if you have like 2 or 3 or 4 different lenses, try it with all of those lenses, especially if they're different focal lengths. I think you're going to be very surprised by how different the results are. Also, try that at different focal points. Okay, anyway, what you're going to do is you want to see how different depths of field benefit or impair the results of different subjects. See how those depths of field work with or against your image style and voice as well. Traditionally, the advice has been to use a deep depth of field with landscape photos and a shallow one with portraits, just enough to isolate the subject. That's good advice, but not necessarily always accurate. There will be times when the rules above aren't the best for a situation. So for this assignment, play with that idea and see what you like when you try different things with depth of field. Okay, what do I mean by subject isolation? Take a look at what you're seeing right now on the screen. I'm shot at f1.8, and if you notice, which is wide open, I'm pretty well isolated from the background. This is subject isolation. You know that there's something back there. I mean, you know what it is because you've seen it, but if you hadn't seen it before, you'd know there was a thing, but maybe not, but not what was on it, not what was written on it. This would be a portrait photo using subject isolation, okay? I am isolated from the background. Subject isolation is something you can do when you have a subject that's separated from your background by different distances based on the focal length and aperture. But in general, with a portrait lens, what you would get is if you're shooting in a wider aperture, then having about 10 feet or so between your subject and your background and just enough depth of field to isolate your subject, to have your subject tip of nose to back of head in focus is what's going to give you subject isolation. We're not just talking about portraits. That can work with any type of subject, by the way. It can work with a plant or a flower, or if you're going to photograph like your favorite stuffed animal, it can work with that as well, okay? Subject isolation is just using your aperture and the depth of field to separate your subject from the background. Selective focus is not subject isolation. I put it up here so that we can talk about it, remind myself to talk about it. Selective focus is something you will always do. You always, if you have picked your subject correctly, selected the focus point, okay? Selective focus is generally shallow depth of field photography in the way I've seen it implemented by people. Really, when we use these two words together, what we're talking about is something you should do with every photo you take, which is to select what you want to have be in focus and how much of the scene you want to have be in focus. Okay, all that aside, play around with this. Take portraits that are wide open, stop down a few stops, stop down all the way. See what happens when you have a portrait where you're shooting with your subject right up against the background. What happens there? Versus what happens when you keep the aperture the same, but your subject gets significantly closer to the camera. What happens when you shoot a landscape at a very wide aperture? What happens when you shoot a landscape at a very small aperture? Things like that. Play around with the different settings, the different subjects, the different apertures, and see how those benefit your creative work. And if you want to do something really fun, when you're shooting at the smaller apertures, put a point source light or multiple point source lights, like fairy lights or something like that, in your image, in the background. And if you want to know why, take a look at any of the round glass review videos I've released in the last year for sure, to look at the analysis of the source point stars for the different lenses, and you'll see how aperture affects the appearance of source point stars. So aperture does not simply control depth of field. For this assignment, that's what you're focusing on. But as a general practice, you can also use aperture to control the way that elements within your image appear when you're taking a photo. Remember to drop me an @ on Instagram or Imgur, and I will look forward to seeing the work that you guys produce for this month's assignment. Take care, everybody. I'll see you in November.